When I watched my wife Amy, to whom I had been married for 3 years, being kissed on the lips by a high society snob named, believe it or not, Reginald, whom she had dated before she married me. I'd had occasion to do a couple smart things in the past. Now I needed to do something clever too. However, since I didn't have a camera, my cell phone was in for repair, I just saw Reginald put her to bed. Amy and I were supposed to be at her dad's house for dinner in less than an hour, and I knew that by the time I would have gotten my camera out, this photo shoot would have been over. However, since Reginald's car was blocking Amy's car, I could cause them a little trouble and get a little revenge while still being smart. Wearing gloves for all my related endeavors, I quickly unscrewed the valves on 3 of his tires, flattened them, and then rebuilt the valves. I retrieved a rubber mallet from the garage and waited behind a bush. Reginald hurried out of the house a few minutes later. As he cussed and knelt down by his right front tire, I stealthily crept up and hit him over the head with the rubber mallet. I didn't hit him hard enough to kill him, but hard enough to incapacitate him. I took the car keys out of Reginald's pocket and threw them as far as I could into the bushes near our house. Since I was a center fielder in high school and had been in college for 2 years, the keys flew far enough away that they would never be found. I pulled credit cards, driver's license, and cash out of his wallet. Who would have thought a rich snob would carry no more than $1.28 in cash? I then wiped a small amount of hair, skin, and blood off the hammer with a rag dipped in bleach, returned the hammer to the garage, and put the rag in a plastic bag. Credit cards and driver's license joined the rag in the bag. With the plastic bag in my hand, I ran to my car, which was parked a few hundred feet away so Reginald couldn't see it, and drove at high speed to my father-in-law's expensive old house. One of the few working payphones left in America was at the 7-Eleven on the way to me. I parked at a nearby store, took off my jacket, put on an unremarkable baseball cap, sweatshirt, and mirrored sunglasses, then headed for the phone. I gave a teenage girl coming out of the Reginald store $28 to call 911 to anonymously report a man lying in the driveway of 15 Ridgeway Terrace. I tossed the plastic bag with the rag, credit cards, and driver's license into the dumpster outside the 7-Eleven. Then I drove to Dear Daddy's house, arriving 10 minutes ahead of schedule. As you may have realized by now, I didn't like Dear Daddy very much. He liked me, in a way, but only because I was the top employee at a large insurance firm he owned. That is, he liked the money I was making him. Dear Daddy, his name is Chester Grimes, was and still is a rich, pompous ass who always thought Amy was too good to marry a guy from a middle-class family like yours truly, Blake Bristol. In fact, based on morals rather than money, I was too good for Amy and Chester. Chester valued promptness, so I called Amy on Chester's landline to find out why she wasn't home yet at the appointed time. She was exhausted and frightened when she answered the phone. "Hi, Amy. Where are you? Your dad's a little angry." "Oh, well, I'm sorry I'm late. There's been a crime in front of our house, and the police are here." "Yes, officer, this is my husband, Blake." "No, you don't need to talk to him, do you?" I heard some argument in the background, and apparently Amy covered the phone with her hand. I heard the phone go from hand to hand, then, "This is Detective Burns. Is this Blake Bristol?" "Yes, officer, what's wrong? Is my wife all right?" "Yes, Mr. Bristol. Physically, she's fine. However, a man named Reginald Swifton was assaulted in your driveway and taken away by ambulance, and his car has just now been towed." "What the hell was Reginald Swifton doing in my fucking house?" I shouted with indignation, loud enough for the always correct Chester Grimes to surely hear. "Your wife hadn't really explained that to us. Perhaps you have some information about it." "What the hell? He's her ex-boyfriend. Maybe he just popped in for a quickie. How the hell should I know? I hope he got the shit kicked out of him, that asshole." "No need to be vulgar, Mr. Bristol. So you don't know anything about why he might have been in your house or who attacked him?" "No, but when you find this guy, tell him I'd like to buy him a beer. Can you take my wife to the hospital and get a swab?" "Not unless she wants to go herself," Burns replied. "What if it was rape and she's too afraid to tell you? Can't you force her to take the test under those circumstances?" I asked frantically. "Unless she says she was sexually assaulted, I'm sorry, but I can't," Burns replied. "Could you at least take detailed photographs of her to show if she was assaulted? Like, Did any bruising or bleeding occur? I begged. Yes, we can do that, Burns replied. Thank you. Could you get the potential crime victim back on the phone, Detective Burns? Yeah, although I'd like to talk to you a little more tomorrow. I'll have my cell phone back by then. Call me then to make an appointment and I'll come to you, I told him, and then gave him my cell phone number. Hi, Blake, honey. Amy started talking. Cut the crap, Amy. I want you to go to the hospital immediately, have Detective Burns drive you, and have a swab taken to see if Reginald raped you. No, 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 no. Where'd you get that idea, Blake? Well, then go prove to me that you didn't have sex with him. How can you accuse me of cheating on you at a time like this? Amy cried. At a time like what? So the bastard was attacked. I don't give a shit about him, and you shouldn't care either. I shouted, and then paused for effect before continuing. Let's do this, honey. Either you take a vaginal swab and the police will witness it before you clean yourself up, or I'm filing for divorce. Fuck you! She yelled, but before she could say anything else, I hung up. Chester was dead pale and angry. What was that? He roared. Well, Chet, I replied. He hated being called Chet. Your daughter cheated on me with that asshole Reginald Swifton, so I'm divorcing her ass. As Chester recovered from the shock, he muttered, You can't talk to me like that or talk about my daughter like that. I have to fire you. The phone rang. I knew it was Amy, so I just picked it up and then threw it back. Could you put this in writing? I asked excitedly, picking up a pen and pad from the kitchen table and holding it out to him. Even if it breaks my heart. If I'm no longer making money for a pompous ass like you, I'll somehow survive getting fired. Chester stammered a bit, including muttering something about how shamelessly ungrateful I was and how he'd be glad to be rid of me, as he wrote, Blake Bristol is fired effective today, putting the date and signing his name. Thanks, asshole, I said, and then walked out the door, clutching my pink slip to my chest while my ringing phone provided background music. Okay, I know you are a little confused by my actions and think I may be crazy. Perhaps a little more information would help clear things up. The two clever things I referenced at the beginning of the narrative were the terms of the prenuptial agreement between Amy and I and the employment agreement with Chester's company, signed at the same time as the prenuptial agreement. I got Amy and Chester to agree to add one provision to each of these contracts. I made the prenuptial agreement reciprocal. That is, if either of us physically harmed the other or had sex with anyone else during the marriage, then the penalties in the prenup would come into play. In my case, I would receive $500,000 from her trust fund before we split our remaining assets 50-50. In her case, she would receive 85% of the assets. If there were children, luckily we didn't have any when I saw Reginald having hers, the injured party would get custody. I never even touched Amy in anger, and I never cheated on her, despite every opportunity to do so. As for the employment contract, if I was fired or demoted in such a way that my earnings or duties were reduced by 10% or more, the non-compete provisions of my employment contract were voided. I was not in the best position to divorce Amy for infidelity and receive what was due under the prenuptial agreement because I had no photographs or records that would constitute definitive proof. However, I had suspected her for a year and had gathered a significant amount of admissible evidence. That is, I did have circumstantial evidence of her cheating long before the Reginald incident. My friend and middle-class attorney Ron Botts told me that the circumstantial evidence gave me a good chance if we got the right judge, and that we could probably gather some more useful information during the investigation. Ron also advised me on what to do and what not to do in relation to the inevitable divorce. I was advised to avoid closing accounts, transferring money or securities, canceling credit cards, etc., until we get a court order to keep records and freeze assets. Rash action would look bad in the eyes of the judge and would damage our case. As soon as I left Chester with steam wafting out of my ears, I bought a disposable cell phone and called Ron's office. Why are you still there at 7 o'clock on a Friday night? I asked. Serving helpless assholes like you, he laughed back. What's up? I explained the situation to him, but only from the moment I got to Chester's house. Ron had some simple advice. Don't come home tonight. Go to the hotel, get your receipts, and be seen on their CCTV cameras. Tomorrow morning, a policeman with a video camera will escort you back home and leave the recording device there. In the meantime, I'll check on Reginald. I'll start divorce proceedings on Monday. I did as instructed. The next morning, Saturday, the policeman and I went to my house, Reginald's sex scene. I walked in the side door and then into the living room. I made a noise and yelled, "Amy, I'm here to pick up some things and then leave." Amy quickly came down the stairs. "Why the hell are you starting to accuse me of cheating and getting my dad to fire you? You ass!" "Did you swab?" I asked sarcastically. "Hell no!" She started to yell before I cut her off. "Then we have nothing to talk about. I'll get my clothes and leave." She was so focused on scolding me that I'm sure Amy didn't see it, but he got good pictures and videos of her face and exposed skin that didn't show any cuts or bruises. I closed and locked the bedroom door, and ignoring her banging and screaming, packed my clothes and valuables into 2 suitcases. I checked the sheets for stains, but she had the good sense to change them. She probably burned them or soaked them in bleach. Gathering my things without a word, I walked past her and out the front door. I filmed her with a telephoto lens from the car as she screamed on the porch outside as I left. When Amy and I were upstairs, he set up a long battery life recorder in the kitchen. "How did the pictures and video turn out?" I asked when we pulled away. "Good. It was easy to see that there were no marks on it. Placing the voice-activated recorder turned out to be a genius decision. Later that day, we overheard her talking to one of her friends, Lila Castle. Amy had Lila punch her in the face and arms, as well as inflict small cuts on her arms and neck. After Lila did what Amy asked, they both went to the clinic to document the cuts and bruises and take pictures. While Amy and Lila were at the clinic, the private investigator and I went back to my house to pick up all the other things I needed and to pick up the tape recorder. Ron called it perfect. On Monday, we sued for adultery. By the end of the week, Amy filed a countersuit for physical abuse. About the time Amy was filing divorce papers on Monday, after cleaning up my office and picking up my cell phone from the repair shop, I went to see Detective Burns. "Where were you when this Reginald Swifton thing happened, Mr. Bristol?" was his first question after the exchange of pleasantries. "Sounds like you're treating me like a suspect," I said, crossing my arms across my chest. "Well, we do have evidence linking you to the scene," he continued. "Well, then you should arrest me because I'm done talking to you and I want my lawyer," I said firmly. Of course, I knew he didn't have any evidence. "Is that really how you want to play it?" "You'll look guilty," Burns continued. "And a second. I thought that when I asked for a lawyer, you wouldn't be able to ask me another question, and you just did. Either arrest me or I'm leaving," I said. I stood up and headed for the door. "We're not done yet," Burns continued without any bravado. "Just with my lawyer," I said, handing him one of Ron's business cards and walking out. I never heard from him again, and neither did Ron. I really wish that at the time the lawsuit and countersuit were filed, I had been privy to Ron's conversation with another private investigator, Dan Drake, who was also a friend of Ron's. My anxiety would have been greatly alleviated, and I would have understood Ron's unwavering confidence in our case. The conversation between Ron and Dan took place 2 days after the countersuit was filed. Ron didn't tell me about it until after the trial. "Dan, I don't want you to tell me anything substantive from what you know, but I need answers to a couple questions." "Hell, Ron, if I can help, I will," Dan replied. "Dan, does the name Amy Bristol mean anything to you?" "Yes, it does. Do you have any clients you've worked for that are interested in Amy Bristol's business?" "Yes, there were, Ron." "Can you give me their names?" "I'll contact them and get back to you, Ron." Dan called Ron a few hours later. "Their names are Elizabeth Moore and Jamie Watkins, and—" "Don't tell me anything else, Dan. Would any client want you to oversee a divorce proceeding in which Amy Bristol is one of the parties?" "Haha, okay, Ron. Yeah, I'm sure at least one of them will." "I'll let you know the date, Dan." "Thank you," Ron finished. While this conversation was going on, I was apparently interviewing Chester's biggest competitor, who had hired me at the same salary Chester's company was paying me, and at nearly twice the commission. Since I had no way of not competing with Chester's company, I contacted all of my old clients within a week, and within a month, Almost 90% of them had transferred their business to my new company. I could afford to pay Ron and the private investigator's bills. In addition, between the start of the divorce proceedings and the trial date, more than 80% of the time I won Chester's company new business when we met face to face. Ron applied for an asset freeze when he filed for divorce. That was granted. Neither Amy nor I could touch our money, except for attorney's fees and other court costs, an allowance granted by the court, or as a result of a special request that the other party either agreed to or by court order. There was no cashing out, canceling credit cards, transferring money from joint accounts to individual accounts, selling stock, canceling insurance policies, or raiding bank safety deposit boxes. The appointment of a judge seemed unfortunate to me, but Ron assured me that it would ultimately benefit us. Judge Matt Moore presided. He was the newest and youngest judge in family court. He was very energetic, confident, and likable, with a suspicious bias against us. I met Matt Moore only once, at a 4th of July party at his nearest neighbor's house about a month before he was confirmed as a judge. I remember because Amy and I had a fight that night because she got drunk and disappeared on me. Moore spoke very highly of my father-in-law, Chester Grimes, in a brief conversation that Moore and I had that night. I asked Ron, "Why did we waive a jury trial if you suspect that because of his relationship with Chester Grimes, Moore is prejudiced against us?" Ron only smiled. "Who's the lawyer here, you or me? Don't piss your underpants. I know what I'm doing. I want to get more for you than the prenup provides," he answered very confidently. Ron explained the pre-trial procedure to me. During the investigation, we would have to disclose what we knew and would use as evidence. The only exception was that if something would only be used for impeachment, that is, would question the credibility of a witness or party, then we didn't have to disclose the evidence or any witness who would present it. Ron did not tell me about his conversation with Dan Drake, and in fact, he had no discoverable information based on that conversation, so it was not disclosed to Amy's attorney, Amanda McAfee, earlier. When we gave answers to Amy's attorney's questions given by Amy under oath, not surprisingly, Lila Castle was claimed as a witness to my alleged assault on Amy. It was alleged that the assault occurred the Saturday after the Reginald incident, when the private investigator and I went to my house to retrieve my belongings. Ron immediately noticed Lila's statement before we had to respond to Amy's inquiries about the assault. Lila's videotaped deposition, which Amy and I both attended even though we never spoke to each other, was on Monday. After Ron pointed out the date of the alleged assault to Lila, he struck. "So, Miss Castle, you are absolutely certain that you witnessed the attack shortly before you accompanied Mrs. Bristol to the clinic for treatment that Saturday, correct?" "Yes, I'm sure," she said, trying to sound confident but failing. "You didn't injure Mrs. Bristol yourself, did you?" Ron continued. Lila and Amy's jaws dropped open, and Amanda McAfee looked puzzled. "Of course not," Lila said hesitantly. "I'm going to play for you an audio tape that an independent witness swears was recorded that Saturday after Mr. Bristol left his house. Tell me, do you recognize these voices?" When Ron scrolled through the tape, all the faces on the other side of the table turned ash gray. When it was done, Ron asked, "Do you recognize the voices? Aren't you and Mrs. Bristol discussing how to give her a bruise and then lie that Mr. Bristol did it?" "You must have set it up," Lila sobbed. "We'll have a voice expert compare your voice in today's testimony to the one on the tape, and then we'll send the case to the DA's office for perjury charges. That's all the questions I have." Not surprisingly, Amy's attorney had no objection. 2 days after Lila's testimony, Amanda McAfee decided to withdraw the counterclaim and asked the court for a counseling order to put the case on hold for 2 months until the parties sought the services of a certified conciliation mediator. Ron vigorously opposed the motion. During oral argument, he said, "Your Honor, they filed the counterclaim in bad faith, and we want an opportunity to get that on the record during trial because it undermines Mrs. Bristol's credibility. In addition, my client has not the slightest interest in reconciliation, and until the case is dismissed, he loses interest on the $500,000 he is going to recover from Mrs. Bristol." Demonstrating his bias, Judge Moore granted Amy's motion, but threw us a bone. If the reconciliation fails and Mr. Bristol prevails in court, Mrs. Bristol will pay 2 months' interest at 4% per annum on any money to which Mr. Bristol is entitled other than the division of assets. Ron warned me to follow the instructions in the order during the conciliation process so as not to give the court any reason to sanction me. He told me not to swear, no matter how much I wanted to. Is the word whore a swear word? I asked him. No, but don't use it. Call her a blatantly unfaithful spouse, Ron replied with a smile. Not surprisingly, I received an email from Chester Grimes 2 days before my scheduled counseling session. I refused to answer his phone calls or even listen to his messages. The letter was very conciliatory and offered me a return to my old job with double my salary and commission. I kept it in case Ron could use it as evidence, but never responded to it. No attorneys were allowed to attend the consultation, only parties. Amy arrived at the counseling session dressed stunningly. She is a sexy, sensual woman, and her closet, makeup, and hair were impeccable. Since the order said nothing about clothing, I showed up in cut-off jeans, sandals, and an old t-shirt from college mottled with holes. Amy hated that shirt and tried to throw it away twice. I also hadn't shaved in 2 days, and my hair was mussed and unwashed. Amy took one look at me and realized it was over, but she tried anyway, no doubt motivated only by the $500,000. Mr. Bristol, I'm surprised at your appearance, the counselor said. The order didn't mention anything about clothing, and that's how I chose to appear. I'm sorry if it doesn't meet with your approval, I replied, trying to avoid a sarcastic tone, but probably without success. The mediator then resumed the session while Amy and I remained silent. Even though I was the complainant, she let Amy speak first. Can't I, as the complainant, speak first? I asked. As a mediator, I can determine the order of the discussion, he parried, obviously still disturbed by my appearance. Amy was a great actress. She told me how much she loved me and wondered why I was suspicious of her. She talked about all the wonderful times we had spent together and cried where appropriate for dramatic effect. It took a good half hour. Either the mediator was moved by Amy's performance or was trying to settle, because as soon as Amy finished, she turned to me with clouded eyes and said, Mr. Bristol, what would you like to say to your dear wife who has just bared her soul? She's not such a good wife. She is a serial cheater and has been grossly unfaithful to me as well as a liar, as clearly evidenced by her account of me beating her. Her entire performance was an act in an attempt to save $500,000. I don't know if she ever loved me, but I don't care. I don't love her. In fact, I hate her, and I want a divorce as soon as possible so I can move on with my life. The mediator and Amy were shocked. For the remainder of the session, I briefly answered questions or responded to statements from both the counselor and Amy. The only response of more than 4 words I gave for the remainder of the session was when a crying Amy said, You didn't even give me a chance to explain why Reginald was there before you freaked out. Then I told you in no uncertain terms to take a swab to prove you didn't have sex with him or accuse him of rape, and that if you didn't, I would divorce you. That was your choice. Live with it. It wasn't taken well. As a last desperate gesture, the mediator said, Mr. Bristol, I want you to stand up, walk over to Amy and hug her to see if that will awaken any feelings in you. I quickly replied, I saw no requirement in the order for me to hug her, and the thought of even touching my blatantly unfaithful soon-to-be ex-wife gives me goosebumps. Since I don't want to lose my breakfast, I decline. Amy jumped up from her chair, started cursing at me as loudly as she could, and probably would have hit me if the mediator hadn't intervened. While the mediator tried to calm Amy down, the wide smile on my face probably wasn't helping the situation. The mediator said, You can go now, Mr. Bristol. The mediator told the court that there was no hope of reconciliation, so the court lifted the stay and the hearing continued. During the hearing, Amy's attorney took my deposition. I truthfully answered all but 2 of her questions. They were, Did you ever actually witness Mrs. Bristol having sex with another man prior to filing for divorce? And, Did you ever see Reginald Swifton in your home when you were married and prior to filing for divorce? Basically, I'm honest, but not stupid. After months of pretrial proceedings, during which Judge Moore showed his bias whenever possible, still protecting the record for appeal, the trial was set for 2 months after the proceedings closed. Ron did not have Amy's deposition. For strategic reasons, he told me. He did, however, have Amy's answer to interrogatories where she swore that she had never had sex with another man during the marriage or before filing for divorce. At trial, we presented our circumstantial evidence of marital infidelity by 3 o'clock on the first day, as we had sufficient evidence to deny the motion for a directed verdict. Despite how prejudiced Moore was, he knew that his judgment would be reversed on appeal if he granted it. Now it was the defendant's turn to present her case. Amy's chief witness, of course, was Amy herself. Under oath, Amy denied that she had ever had sex with another man while married. Judge Moore looked a little embarrassed at one point, but for the most part he ate out of her hands and overruled almost all of Ron's objections. It was almost 5 o'clock when she finished, so Judge Moore ordered that the hearing be continued at 9 the next morning. As we were gathering our papers to leave, a guy with a big smile on his face walked up to Ron. When Ron saw him, he smiled back. I had seen this guy sitting in the courtroom during Amy's testimony, but I didn't know who he was. "Blake, this is Dan Drake, a friend of mine," Ron said. I shook Drake's hand with a puzzled expression on my face. "I have some information for you, Ron," Drake said, and his smile grew even wider. "It has to do with refuting Amy Bristol's testimony." "Let's go to my office and order dinner," Ron chuckled as the three of us walked out. In Ron's office, Drake showed us one DVD of a naked Amy bringing James Watkins to the finish line. Drake said he had another DVD, but Ron stopped him from showing it to us. "I just want you to testify to the release date of your second DVD. If that's what I think, but I don't know for sure, I don't want to see it now, and I'm sure it will never be shown in court." At precisely 9 the next morning, Ron began his interrogation of Amy. After questioning her about Reginald's visit the day I witnessed him having her, he asked, "Do you know a man named James Watkins?" "Yes," she replied hesitantly. "And his wife is Jamie Watkins?" "Yes." "When did you first meet him?" "I don't remember exactly." "Wasn't it at a party at your father's house 18 months ago when he came there with his wife Jamie?" "Maybe." "Hadn't he moved to town and started working for your father a month before that?" "I suppose." "Well, did he or didn't he? Do we need to call him or Mrs. Jamie Watkins to the stand?" Ron growled, and his pleasant demeanor suddenly disappeared. After an awkward pause, Amy, stammering, said, "Yes, I remember now. It was at that party about a year and a half ago that I first met him." "So you never met him before you were married, did you?" "No," Amy answered hesitantly. "Mrs. Bristol, did you ever have sex with Mr. James Watkins?" No, you keep accusing me of cheating," Amy whimpered, then cried. "Your Honor, at this time I would like to play the DVD. Because of its nature, I ask that it only be displayed on the monitors at the counsel tables, the bench, and the witness stand, and not on the main courtroom monitor." "Very good, Mr. Botts. Bailiff, please push the right buttons to make this happen," Judge Moore said. After a pause and a nod from the bailiff, Ron pressed the play button on the DVD player. Amy cried out and then covered her mouth with her hands when she saw what appeared on the screen. "Is that a video of you and Mr. Watkins having sex, Mrs. Bristol?" Ron asked after it had played for about 60 seconds. No, it's fake." "Turn it off," Amy sobbed. "No further questions, Your Honor. If there are no questions from the defendant, I would like to call Dan Drake to the stand." "No questions," Amanda McAfee said, wincing as Amy left the witness stand in tears. "However, I do have an objection. This video was never provided to us during the investigation and should not be used for any purpose." "In fact, Your Honor, I didn't find out about it until around 7 o'clock last night, but that doesn't matter. The DVD and the testimony of Mr. Dan Drake, who will authenticate it, is being used only to rebut Mrs. Bristol's testimony, not for any other purpose." Judge Moore was uncomfortable but had no choice. Objection overruled. With proper authentication, I will allow the DVD to be used for rebuttal purposes only. Dan Drake was a confident and unflappable witness. After Ron made everyone aware of his qualifications, he authenticated the DVD, explaining that he had shot the video at Mr. and Mrs. Watkins's home with the permission of his client, Mrs. Jamie Watkins. That it showed James Watkins and Amy Bristol having sex while she was married to Blake Bristol, and before the divorce papers were filed. Judge Moore now looked extremely embarrassed, especially when Ron asked Drake, "Do you have another video of Mrs. Bristol having sex with another married man while she was married to Mr. Bristol?" "Yes," Drake answered affirmatively. "What is the release date of this video, Mr. Drake?" "July 4th, 2012, Drake answered, looking directly at Judge Moore. Judge Moore interrupted him. "I need to meet with the attorneys and the parties in my chambers right now." As we entered the courtroom, the judge took off his robe and sat thoughtfully. Finally, he spoke. "Miss McAfee, your client, Mrs. Bristol, appears to have perjured herself. I may be obliged to bring that to the attention of the district attorney and certainly comment on it if I write an opinion. I am going to recess the court for 24 hours. I suggest that you negotiate a settlement during that time." Amy lowered her eyes to the floor, and Amanda McAfee looked shocked but resigned. "If you don't, you're not going to like what happens next," Moore continued. "Unless someone has a very good reason to present additional evidence, I am ruling that the testimony in this case is closed. I will also make a motion that the record be sealed." By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Amy had written me a check for $500,000 plus interest, paid all of Ron's fees and disbursements, and signed a document agreeing to the divorce and transferring 60% of our assets to me rather than the 50% specified in the prenuptial agreement. That extra 10% was just my little bonus. In return, we settled the case with prejudice, promised not to bring Amy's perjury to the attention of the district attorney, and filed a joint petition for dissolution of marriage for irreconcilable differences, and sealed the record. That same day, Judge Moore excitedly approved the settlement agreement, granted the divorce action, and sealed the record. When Ron, a few others from his office, Dan Drake, and, surprisingly, Jamie Watkins, and I went out to dinner to celebrate that night, I whispered a question to Ron. Why was Moore so insistent that this case be finalized and the record sealed? "Of course, I don't really know anything about that," Ron smirked. "Otherwise, as a bailiff, I would have had to file a motion to recuse Moore and report him to the Ethics Commission. But I'll bet he had a personal interest in the matter," Ron said, and his smirk was now devilish. After thinking for a few seconds, I decided that I didn't need to ask any further questions. 4 months later, I read that Judge Matt Moore and his wife Elizabeth Moore had been granted a divorce due to irreconcilable differences. The details were not made public, but I noticed that when driving around town, Judge Moore was now driving a 5-year-old Ford, whereas when I met him at a 4th of July party in 2012, he was driving a new Mercedes.